All right, buckle up because today we're diving deep into India's minimum support price and those huge farmer protests you've probably heard about. It's a complicated topic where economics meets real-life struggles. We're talking food security, political battles, and a whole lot of strong opinions. But by the end of this deep dive, you'll understand why these protests happened, what farmers are demanding, and what the government's perspective is. We've got all sorts of stuff to look at, in-depth reports, articles from different sides, and even some historical context to help us understand how we got here. So are you ready to get into it?
Different. This is a topic I'm really passionate about. I think it's fascinating how a policy that's supposed to help farmers can cause so much controversy.
I know, right? Imagine hundreds of thousands of farmers camping out for over a year demanding change. It shows just how much is at stake. But before we get into all of that, let's start with the basics. What exactly tests this minimum support price everyone's talking about?
Well, the minimum support price, or MSP, is basically a safety net for farmers in India. The government sets a minimum price for 24 essential crops, mostly staples like rice and wheat, to protect farmers from market crashes. So even if market prices plummet, farmers are guaranteed a certain income.
So it's like a price floor to ensure they don't lose everything if the market suddenly goes bad. But we're talking about millions of people's livelihoods, right? Is that really enough to make a difference?
That's a big part of what the debate is all about.
Mm-hmm.
The MSP system is meant to achieve several goals. First, of course, is protecting farmers from big losses. It also ensures that India has enough food for everyone and that farmers are encouraged to keep growing these essential crops, even if the market isn't looking so good. The government actually buys these crops at the MSP to create a buffer stock for public distribution programs.
Oh, I see. So it's not just about individual farmers, but national food security as well. That makes the stakes even higher. But I'm curious, how do they decide what these MSP figures should be? It can't be just a random number, right?
No, not at all. There's a special group called the Commission for Agricultural Costs and Prices, or CACP. They're responsible for analyzing all the data and recommending MSPs to the government.
So what kinds of things do they look at?
Well, they have to take into account a lot of factors. The cost of production is a big one, things like labor, seeds, fertilizers, everything involved in growing the crop. Then they look at market trends, supply and demand, what the prices are doing, and how things might affect consumers.
So they're trying to find a good balance, I guess.
Exactly. They want to make sure farmers get a fair price, but also make sure food doesn't become too expensive for everyone else. Actually, since 2018-19, the government has been trying to ensure that farmers get at least a 50% return over their production costs. And this includes the value of family labor, which is a huge step in recognizing everyone's contribution to farming.
It sounds like a lot of thought goes into setting these prices, but then this is where I get confused. If this system exists, why are farmers protesting so fiercely? If it's working as intended, what's missing?
That's the core of the whole issue. The MSP system exists, but a lot of farmers feel like it's not really doing enough.
In what way?
Well, for one, many farmers argue that the current calculations for MSP don't accurately reflect their actual costs. They say that things are more expensive than the government estimates, so they're not actually getting a fair return even with MSP.
So they want a more realistic price calculation.
Exactly. They're also pushing for the MSP system to be expanded to more crops. Right now, it only covers 24, and many farmers grow other crops that don't have that same safety net.
Wider coverage, a more realistic price calculation. Those seem like pretty reasonable demands. What else are they protesting about?
Another huge issue is that there's no legal guarantee for MSP.
What do you mean?
Well, right now, the government isn't obligated to purchase crops at the announced MSP. They can choose to buy less than what's offered or not buy at all, leaving farmers vulnerable to those market swings and potentially being exploited by private buyers.
So even if the MSP is good, there's no guarantee they'll actually be able to sell their crops at that price.
That's right. It's like having a safety net with holes in it. That's why farmers are demanding a law to make MSP a legal right, so they can always be sure of getting a fair price.
That makes sense. But even if the MSP is implemented perfectly, doesn't that still just guarantee a basic income? What about farmers who want to do more than just survive?
You've hit on another key point. Farmers aren't just asking for survival. They're demanding a life of dignity and respect. The protests are fueled by a desire to make farming economically viable, a profession where they can thrive, not just scrape by. The call for the government to double farmers' income is a reflection of this desire for a better future.
It's about more than just price points. It's about ensuring that these farmers can actually make a decent living. It sounds like they have a very strong case. But we focused a lot on their side of the story. What about the government? What's their perspective on all of this?
Well, the government maintains that they're fully committed to supporting farmers and ensuring they receive fair prices. They point to the fact that they've been consistently increasing MSPs and that they've been procuring more crops at MSP in recent years.
So they're saying they're already doing a lot to help.
Yes, but they're hesitant about making MSP a legal guarantee.
Why is that?
They argue that it could lead to problems like inflation and make India less competitive in global markets. They believe that the current system, along with other initiatives like encouraging farmers to diversify their crops, is enough to support farmers.
So they acknowledge the need for support, but maybe not such a big sweeping change like guaranteeing MSP by law.
That's a fair assessment.
Oh.
And even within the government, there are different ideas about how to best support farmers. Some reports suggest focusing MSP on crops where India needs to boost production, rather than just sticking with rice and wheat.
Interesting. So it's not as simple as farmers versus the government.
But not at all. There's a whole range of opinions and ideas about how to approach this.
But before we get into those other perspectives, let's rewind a bit. I think it's helpful to understand where this all started. What's the historical context of MSP in India?
To really understand where we are today, we need to go back to the 1960s. Imagine India as a newly independent nation facing severe food shortages and a rapidly growing population.
So food security was a huge concern back then.
Absolutely. The government needed to find a way to encourage farmers to increase production, especially of staples like rice and wheat.
So MSP wasn't originally meant to address oversupply, like some people think today, but to tackle the opposite problem: scarcity.
Exactly. It was a tool for national food security.
Yeah.
But over time, as India's agriculture developed and changed, MSP became less about avoiding famine and more about protecting farmer incomes in a fluctuating market.
So these issues we're talking about aren't new. They've been around for decades.
You got it. There's always been this struggle to balance the needs of farmers with the complexities of managing a huge and constantly evolving agricultural system.
That makes a lot of sense.
But we're only scratching the surface here. To really grasp the whole MSP debate, we need to dig deeper into the challenges facing the system itself.
And that's where things get even more interesting. Hold on tight, because next we're going to unpack those challenges and explore some of the potential solutions being debated. All right, so we've seen how MSP has evolved over time, but things really came to a head with those massive farmer protests back in 2020 and 2021. It wasn't just a few local demonstrations. This was huge. We're talking hundreds of thousands of farmers, mostly from Punjab and Haryana, camped out near Delhi for over a year. What made these protests so significant, and what were they fighting for?
These protests were historic. It really showed how determined India's farmers are. Imagine enduring harsh weather conditions for over a year just to make their voices heard. The immediate trigger was the government's introduction of those 3 new farm laws.
Oh yeah, I remember hearing about those.
These laws aim to deregulate agricultural markets, basically giving private companies a bigger role in setting crop prices.
So the farmers saw this as a threat to the MSP system.
Exactly. They worry that these reforms would weaken the protections they had. They feared being left at the mercy of corporations who might try to pay them even less for their crops.
And MSP, even without a legal guarantee, has been a lifeline for a lot of these farmers, right?
Especially in places like Punjab and Haryana, where the government procurement at MSP is really well established.
So it wasn't just about the laws themselves, but about the deeper anxieties they created.
Exactly. It was about protecting their way of life, their livelihoods, and ensuring fair compensation for their hard work. The fact that farmers from all over India, speaking different languages, united for a common cause shows just how important this issue was to them.
It's a powerful example of what people can achieve when they come together.
Yeah.
So what happened? Did they get what they wanted?
Well, after months of intense negotiations and a standstill that had the whole country on edge, the government actually did repeal all 3 farm laws.
Wow, that's huge.
It was a major victory for the farmers and proved that peaceful protests can make a real difference.
It definitely shows their dedication and how much they were willing to sacrifice to make their voices heard. But what about their other big demand, the legal guarantee for MSP? Did they get that too?
That one's still up in the air. While the government agreed to form a committee to talk about the issue, they hasn't actually committed to making MSP a legal right.
So the debate's not over yet.
Not by a long shot.
But why is the government so resistant to this idea?
Well, they have a couple of main arguments. One is that it could lead to inflation. If the government is obligated to buy crops at a certain price, no matter what, food prices could go up for everyone. They also worry that it could hurt India's competitiveness in the global market.
So they're saying they're trying to strike a balance between supporting farmers and managing the overall economy.
That's their perspective, yes.
We've heard from the farmers and we've heard from the government. But this can't be a simple for or against issue, right? There must be experts who see value in a legal MSP guarantee.
You're absolutely right. There are a lot of experts who argue that legalizing MSP is crucial, both for protecting farmers and for ensuring food security in India.
What are their arguments?
Well, they say that a legal guarantee would give much-needed stability to millions of farmers who are vulnerable to those market fluctuations we talked about earlier. And it would also protect them from potential exploitation by private buyers who might try to take advantage of them.
So it's about giving farmers more power and security.
That's a big part of it. But some experts go even further. They argue that a legal guarantee would encourage farmers to grow a wider variety of crops.
How so?
Well, right now, there's a big emphasis on MSP for just a few crops, mainly rice and wheat.
Right.
This has led to a kind of monoculture in some regions, which can be bad for the environment. If MSP was guaranteed for a wider range of crops, farmers would have more options, leading to a more diverse and sustainable agricultural landscape.
So it could actually have positive environmental consequences as well.
That's the argument, yes. And there's another potential benefit. Legal MSP could reduce India's reliance on imports for certain crops.
Oh, I see.
This could save the country a lot of money and boost domestic production, which is good for the economy overall.
It sounds like there are some pretty strong arguments in favor of legalizing MSP. But I know there are also concerns about potential downsides. What are some of the main worries people have?
One of the biggest concerns is the possibility of market distortions. By artificially setting prices, the government could create imbalances in supply and demand. This could lead to overproduction of some crops while others get neglected.
So it might actually end up hurting the very farmers it's supposed to help.
Potentially, yes. And some critics also worry about the impact on consumers. If food prices go up because of MSP, it's the poorest people who will be hit the hardest.
So it's a tough balancing act.
You've got it. Trying to support farmers without creating unintended consequences for the rest of the population.
Are there any other concerns we should be aware of?
Well, the administrative challenges of implementing a legal MSP system across the entire country can't be ignored.
What do you mean?
Think about it. We're talking about procuring, storing, and distributing massive quantities of crops.
Yeah.
This would require a huge overhaul of the existing infrastructure, and it wouldn't be cheap.
So it's not just a matter of passing a law, there are real logistical hurdles to overcome.
Exactly. And then there's the international angle. Some experts are worried that a legal MSP could be seen as a trade barrier by other countries.
That could lead to some diplomatic issues.
Potentially, yes. It could even conflict with international trade rules.
This is more complicated than I thought. Who knew that something as seemingly simple as setting a minimum price for crops could have such far-reaching implications?
It really goes to show how interconnected everything is. Economics, social welfare, the environment, even international relations, it all ties together.
Absolutely.
We need to carefully consider all these different factors before jumping to any conclusions.
That's a good point. It's clear that finding the right solution requires a nuanced and comprehensive approach. But before we get into potential solutions, I think it's important to acknowledge the broader challenges that any MSP system, legal or not, faces in today's world.
You're right. Understanding these challenges is crucial for evaluating how effective and sustainable any proposed solution can be.
So what are some of the biggest hurdles facing the MSP system right now?
One of the most significant is the financial burden on the government. Buying up tons of crops at a guaranteed price takes a lot of money.
And that can strain the national budget, especially during tough economic times.
Exactly. And then there are those potential market distortions we talked about earlier. MSP can incentivize farmers to focus on just a few crops, which can lead to imbalances and affect food prices for everyone.
So finding that sweet spot where MSP supports farmers without messing up the market is really important.
Absolutely. And then you have the logistical challenges. Storing all these crops properly is a huge undertaking.
You need massive warehouses, transportation, and ways to prevent spoilage.
Exactly. And that can lead to waste, which further strains resources and raises concerns about sustainability.
So it's not just about buying the crops, it's also about making sure they don't go to waste.
Precisely. And we can't forget about the environmental impact. The current focus on MSP for water-intensive crops like rice and wheat has been linked to problems like declining groundwater levels and soil degradation.
So the MSP system, while meant to help farmers, might actually be contributing to some serious environmental issues.
It's definitely something we need to address. Finding ways to encourage sustainable farming practices within the MSP system is crucial.
All right, so we've laid out the challenges, but are there any solutions on the horizon? Are people working on ways to address these issues and make MSP more effective and sustainable for everyone involved?
Definitely. There are a lot of innovative ideas being discussed, and it's encouraging to see people thinking outside the box.
Well, let's hear them. What are some of these potential solutions that could reshape the future of MSP in India? Okay, so we've explored the challenges, but where do we go from here? What are some of the solutions people are proposing to make MSP more effective and sustainable?
Well, there are a lot of smart folks working on this, and it's exciting to see what they're coming up with. One idea that's gaining traction is giving states more control over MSP instead of having a one-size-fits-all national policy.
So instead of a blanket approach, each state could set its own prices and manage procurement based on what works best for them.
Precisely. This would be a game changer, especially for states that grow a lot of crops beyond just rice and wheat, the main ones covered by MSP. It allows for more flexibility and lets states respond better to their own unique market conditions.
That makes a lot of sense. What other solutions are people talking about?
Another promising avenue is focusing on those wholesale markets where farmers sell their produce.
You mean the mandis?
Yes, the mandis. They're basically regulated marketplaces where farmers can sell their crops at transparent prices so everyone knows what's going on.
Oh, okay. So how can we improve the mandis?
Well, for one, we need to invest in better infrastructure. Many mandis are in dire need of upgrades, and that can hurt farmers who rely on them to sell their crops. Improving access to these markets and making sure they're transparent and efficient would be huge for farmers, especially those who depend on MSP. It would help cut down the power of those middlemen who often take a big chunk of their profits.
So it's about empowering farmers and giving them more control over where and how they sell their produce.
Exactly. And we can't forget about the role of technology in all of this. Think about digital platforms and mobile apps that can connect farmers directly with buyers and give them access to real-time market information.
I see what you mean.
Imagine a farmer in a remote village having the same information about market prices and trends as a trader in the city.
That could level the playing field in a big way.
It would help farmers make informed decisions about when and where to sell their crops. And it could even facilitate secure online transactions.
These solutions sound promising, but I'm thinking back to those concerns we discussed earlier, things like inflation and market distortions. How do we ensure that these solutions don't create those unintended consequences?
That's where careful planning and constant monitoring come in. For example, if we decentralize MSP, we need to make sure states don't start competing with each other and driving prices down in a race to the bottom. And with mandis, we need to make sure there's fair competition and prevent monopolies from forming.
So it's about finding that balance again, right? Supporting farmers without creating new problems for everyone else.
Exactly. The government needs to act as a facilitator, setting clear guidelines, ensuring transparency and accountability, and creating a level playing field for everyone involved.
It's a big responsibility.
It is. And speaking of responsibility, we can't forget about the environmental impact of all of this.
Right. How do we make sure these solutions are also good for the planet?
Well, what if we tied MSP to sustainable farming practices? Imagine a system where farmers are rewarded not just for how much they grow, but for how they grow it.
I like that idea.
We could give them incentives to adopt eco-friendly methods,
Right.
like organic farming, water conservation, and techniques to improve soil health.
It's about shifting the focus from quantity to quality, right?
Precisely. We need to align economic incentives with environmental goals. Imagine in India, where agriculture is not only productive, but also resilient, sustainable, and in harmony with nature.
That's a vision I think we can all get behind.
It is, isn't it?
Well, we've covered a lot in this deep dive, from the origins of MSP to the challenges it faces and the potential solutions for the future.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
But I think we've managed to unpack it pretty well. What are some of the key takeaways you hope our listeners will remember from all of this?
The biggest one for me is that MSP is about so much more than just economics. It's about the livelihoods of millions of farmers, the food security of a nation, and the future of our environment. The decisions we make about MSP have real-world consequences for people and the planet.
It's a powerful reminder that even those technical policies that seem really dry can have a huge impact on all of us.
And as we've seen, there's no one-size-fits-all solution. The debate around MSP is multifaceted, with trade-offs, conflicting interests, and the need to constantly adapt and innovate.
So it's important to stay informed and engage in these discussions thoughtfully.
Exactly. Approach this issue with nuance, empathy, and a willingness to consider all sides of the story.
That's great advice. Now, for our final thought, what's one question you'd like our listeners to consider as they reflect on everything we've discussed today?
What really strikes me is how the MSP debate highlights the changing relationship between farmers, the market, and the government. This isn't just an Indian issue, it's a global one. All over the world, people are grappling with the question of how to ensure fair pay for food producers while balancing economic realities and environmental sustainability. What do you think is the best way forward?
That's a question worth pondering. We've only scratched the surface here, but I hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of the complexities of MSP and why it matters so much. What resonated with you most? Do you think legalizing MSP is the answer, or are there other ways to ensure the well-being of farmers and a thriving agricultural sector? Let us know your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And remember, knowledge is power, especially when it comes to issues as complex as this. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.